Hello, everyone. I am Michael Steelman, Director of Alumni Career Management and Professional Networks for William & Mary, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's William & Mary webinar, U.S.-China Relations in 2022 and Beyond. This is presented by the William & Mary Alumni Association in partnership with the William & Mary Reeve Center for International Studies and William & Mary's Global Research Institute. Before I turn things over to our esteemed panel, I have a few technology items to cover. Today's session is being recorded, and we will notify all registrants once the recording is posted to wmalumni.com/webinars. Questions are welcome, and our moderator will address as many questions as time will allow. If you roll over the bottom portion of the Zoom window, you should see a Q&A icon appear. Please use that feature to submit your questions, and we will monitor the Q&A as well as the chat throughout the hour. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to invite Dr. Stephen Hansen, William & Mary's Vice Provost for Academic and International Affairs, to say a few words about the exciting international programs happening today at William & Mary, and officially turn things over to our panel. Thank you, Dr. Hansen.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to everybody who's joined us today for this really important discussion. This is an amazing opportunity for us to show the power of the William & Mary Alumni Network. It is rare that you're going to find a university that has this level of expertise on a topic of such critical importance to our country. And not only experts willing to participate, but experts who organize the very panel you're about to enjoy. And so we're really grateful to you all for joining us today, and to the panelists as well. William & Mary has in its next strategic plan a goal of expanding our reach, and expanding our global reach is a big part of that strategy. We think that we need to be known around the world as the leading force for discussions of this nature that really affect all of us in humanity. And we at William & Mary also have very deep ties in China. U.S.-China relations is something near and dear to us. We continue to enjoy wonderful university partnerships with leading Chinese universities, including Beijing Normal University, where one of our panelists studied, and Tsinghua University, where another of our panelists studied. Those ties remain valuable to us despite all the geopolitical tensions, and in some ways are even more important in these times when it's very difficult for us sometimes to have conversations across the divides. Our research and teaching on China spans departments and schools. Our Chinese Studies program in modern languages and literatures covers topics ranging from modern Chinese consumer culture to big data analysis of classical Chinese texts. And in the Global Research Institute, we have wonderful studies being done of the Belt and Road Initiative by our aid data group, which have been cited around the world as some of the more insightful analysis of how Chinese development strategy interacts with developing countries around the world. At the Reeve Center for International Studies, we continue to support study abroad in China, even in these difficult times, and we welcome still hundreds of Chinese students, both undergraduate and graduate, to William & Mary each year, who continue to make incredible contributions to our educational program. So suffice it to say that this topic of U.S.-China relations in 2022 and beyond is one that we could not be more excited to support. You can see that we've already decided nothing more will happen in 2021. So, we can't tell you what will happen in the next 3 weeks, but 2022 and beyond we can cover. So without further ado, I'm now going to turn it over to the chair of our panel, who's going to moderate everything expertly, and that's Shannon Tiezzi, who is the editor-in-chief of the very important very important venue, the Diplomat. Shannon is going to introduce the panel and moderate our discussion. Let me say a few words about her background. She is William & Mary, class of 2009. Her main focus at the Diplomat is on China, and she writes on China's foreign relations, domestic politics, and economy. Shannon previously served as a research associate at the U.S.-China Policy Foundation, where she hosted the weekly television show China Forum. She received her MA from Harvard University in addition to her BA from William & Mary. And as I mentioned, she has studied at Tsinghua University in Beijing as well. So Shannon, thanks so much for moderating. I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Steve. And thanks to Michael and the William & Mary Alumni Association for hosting this event and doing a lot behind the scenes so that it runs smoothly for us and for all of our audience members. As Steve outlined, I think it really says volumes about the strength of William & Mary's alumni cohort that we are able to pull together an all-star panel of alumni to talk about U.S.-China relations, which is one of the most important topics in the world today, and certainly one of the topics of most interest in the world today. So I'll quickly introduce our panelists. We have Craig Broderick from the class of 1981, who is a senior director at Goldman Sachs. We have Jacob Dreyer from the class of 2008, who's a senior editor at Palgrave in Shanghai, and Earl Carr, class of 2001, the chief global strategist at Pivotal Advisors, and also the editor of the new book, From Trump to Biden and Beyond. So I hope you're all as excited as I am to hear their thoughts on this momentous relationship and the developments that we've seen over the course of 2021. But before we turn to our panelists, we actually want to hear from you, from the audience. We have a few poll questions on key topics in US-China relations, which you can see they should have just popped up on your screen. So if you take a moment to answer these, I'll read the questions out very quickly. Question 1, do you think it's possible for the US and China to decouple their economies? Question 2, are you optimistic in the future of US-China economic engagement? Question 3, what issue are you most concerned about in US-China relations? Question 4, what issue are you most optimistic about in US-China relations? And question 5, do you believe China will be the strongest global economy in the world by 2030? So for anyone who's just joining us, that's a poll you saw pop up on your screen. Please weigh in because we are going to refer back to this over the course of our discussion. We want to know what you guys think as well. But I'm going to kick off our discussion now while people are weighing in on the polls. And I want to start with Earl. As I mentioned, he has edited a book, From Trump to Biden and Beyond. So I want to ask you, what changed from Trump to Biden? Do you think relations are heading in a new trajectory under Biden, or are they largely sticking to the path that was laid down under Trump, which frankly is a very worrying path?
Thank you so much, Shannon, for that great introduction. And thank you once again to the College of William & Mary and my esteemed colleagues, especially Craig Broderick, who has read every single word in my book, as well as endorsed it. And my special thanks to Jacob, who is the publisher of this book. And it was kind of his idea. So he is the person to thank for the book. And I should also mention that my wife went to William & Mary. And so did Craig's. And Craig reminds me, and we're still married. So there you have it. So it's a great question. I think what has changed. In short, not much. And I think the more important question is why has not much changed? And I think the reason is threefold. First, Biden, when he was elected, was under enormous pressure to be able to prove to Congress that he was not just going to continue the Obama China-like policies that had been implemented in the past. Number two, he was under enormous pressure from Congress, both Republicans and Democrats in his own party, to demonstrate a much tougher stance on China vis-a-vis, his foreign policy. You saw this very clearly when Anthony Blinken testified at Congress. And so as a result, a lot of the policies under the Trump administration, particularly from a trade standpoint, has remained in place.
I want to tease out something else that we highlighted in the poll. One term that made its way into common parlance under Trump that remains very commonly used in headlines and articles is decoupling, which is, as we spelled out a little bit more in the poll, it's this idea that the US and China can somehow separate out their businesses. And Craig Broderick here is an expert, he's worked on financial issues relating to China for decades. So I'd like to get your thoughts on this issue of decoupling, Craig. We talk a lot about it, we hear a lot about it. Are you actually seeing this play out on the ground? Is this actually impacting investment decisions that are being made either by US or Chinese firms?
Craig, you're on mute.
There we go. My screen was frozen. Can you hear me now? Is that a yes? Can you hear me?
Yeah,
okay,
you're good.
Thanks. Right. So the issue is very interesting, and it's complex, and it depends heavily on the individual circumstances of the companies that or other entities that you're talking about. You've seen examples of decoupling that is rather more significant, rather more substantive, like the tennis discussions most recently. You've seen, I would say, a lot more sort of random threats, but not actually resulting in concrete actions. You know, the reality is the U.S. and China are bound together in so many different ways and in such magnitudes in the economic space in particular, but others as well, that true decoupling is unlikely in an absolute sense. That being said, you know, COVID, for example, showed the vulnerabilities associated with, for example, concentrated supply chains. And so even in the absence of political pressures, companies would have an incentive to diversify their supply bases, and they are doing so. And decoupling, you know, you could sort of characterize that as a form, but the political issues are not the motivating factors in this regard. You know, in contrast, you may see more profound decoupling in areas like technology, right? I mean, the 5G issue as a result of you know, the desire for both sort of spheres of influence, if you will, to have dominance has resulted in potentially an Asian, you know, China-led 5G technology that may be incompatible with the U.S. led Western technology. So we will, you know, we'll see how that plays out over time. Clearly, there are going to be stresses and strains across all of these parameters, and we'll have to see how it works out. At the end of the day, you know, one would expect some decoupling versus what we have now, but hope not too much, given that economic ties of this sort are a powerful incentive for the countries to keep talking and recognize mutual interests rather than coming to loggerheads, not only in economic, but then increasingly political and social and other parameters as well.
Jacob, I think you can offer a slightly different perspective on this question because you're working for an international firm, but you're based in China. So what is your take on all this talk of decoupling? We occasionally see articles claiming that China is trying to squeeze out or pressure foreign firms. From your experience living in China, have you seen anything change? Is there any shift? Does it feel like a less welcoming environment for foreign companies in China now than it did, you know, maybe 5 years ago? You're on mute, Jacob.
Yeah, I just noticed that. I've lived and worked in China for about 10 years. And as you guys can see, I'm visibly almost a brand ambassador for foreigners. You know, I don't look Chinese at all. So any interaction that I might have with anybody, whether there's the old lady selling vegetables or, you know, the policeman or anybody, they definitely know that I'm a foreigner. And so sometimes, you know, my mother has on a few occasions been like, oh, are you safe? In April of 2020, when the COVID epidemic was really hitting the US hard, actually the US consulate emailed all American citizens saying, we recommend you leave China immediately. And some Americans I knew were joking like, oh, are the bombs going to start dropping soon or something? What are they talking about? In the end, I don't know what Secretary Pompeo was talking about, but I didn't leave and I didn't really suffer any consequences as a result. What I think has happened in the past 5 years, a lot of people cite 2008 as a critical date at which some people in the Chinese leadership, they had been modeling their country in so many ways on the United States. For example, I was recently chatting with Andy Xie, who used to be at Morgan Stanley, and he said, you know, back in the 90s to 2000s, you know, the American finance people, like the Chinese government, listened to them just religiously because they wanted what America had. And then at a certain point in 2008, they were like, hold on, you guys don't necessarily know, I don't know if this is true or not, but this apparently, they decided that they didn't necessarily want what America had anymore. And that's had a long lasting reverberation. But during the COVID period in particular, we've seen a lot of foreigners leaving China. And so some people will talk about like, oh, they're getting all kicked out or whatever. And of course, there are very severe restrictions that are kind of justified on the grounds of COVID. For example, no one is business traveling. Recently, that's been changed, but you can't get a business visa. Your family members can't join you if you're an executive here, things like that. But I think the bottom line is that the Chinese government they try to get what they, if a foreign organization can provide what the Chinese cannot provide for themselves, then the Chinese want that organization in their country and they will incentivize it. So in the past 2 years since COVID started, we've seen large finance, new funds. BlackRock raised a 1.1 billion fund during this time, just for example. After the decoupling, after Trump, in the midst of COVID, a lot of these finance companies are coming into China bigger than ever before. At the same time, you see a lot of, let's say in 2017 in Beijing South Ring Road, they demolished a lot of these so-called low-end populations houses. They kicked out the migrant workers. And nowadays you see a lot of these, quote, from the Chinese government's perspective, low-end foreigners are getting kicked out. But at the same time, they're really trying to attract more like high value added foreigners. And so I don't see any sort of decoupling, but I see a step change in how the Chinese government perceives its value. It is no longer kind of like, oh, you know, there's the joke, filth, fail in London, try Hong Kong. And when I first came to Shanghai, there was a lot of people who maybe they were coming to China because they thought it was a more easy place to do work than, say, New York. And the Chinese government has kind of decided, no, we're New York now. You might not be able to make it here, but you know, we will have strongly powerful proposition for ambitious people. But as far as that, you know, Canadian guy who doesn't know what to do, so he wants to teach English, yeah, he's gone. I don't see that as decoupling. I see it as something a bit more complex. Thanks.
Another change that we've seen over the past couple of years is that China is becoming more assertive in trying to get foreign firms to follow its bottom line. We've seen this, you know, in terms of demanding that airlines list Taiwan a certain way on their websites was a very famous example, but also anytime there's a map of China, it has to include not only Taiwan, but the 9-dash line, the South China Sea. On the other side, you have pressure building in the United States on foreign firms who do business in China over human rights issues, you know, issues of democratic values. And the NBA was a perfect example of this in 2019, where it got fire from both sides after the Rockets GM tweeted in support of Hong Kong protesters. The entire NBA for a while was persona non grata in China, and then it was also severely criticized in the United States for not taking a stronger stance in support of the Hong Kong protesters. So in that sense, it does feel like kind of from a grassroots bottom-up way, there's pressure from both sides for companies to choose. You know, are you loyal to China? Are you a faithful old friend of China? Or do you support US human rights and democracy values? So Earl, I wonder if you can just weigh in on this. How do you interpret this? And is it going to become infeasible at some point for companies to walk this tightrope and be able to have a good reputation in both countries?
Great question, Shannon. And you know, it's in many ways tangentially related to this notion of decoupling. I actually personally don't like the word decoupling because I don't think that the United States and China can ever functionally decouple their economies because that would be fundamentally catastrophic for both economies. But I think there is something known as, I think what we're seeing more appropriately is targeted decoupling. And Craig mentioned this, where certain sectors that are particularly in the high tech, 5G, you know, are being under enormous pressure to either not invest. We saw this most particularly this past weekend with the US Treasury listing SenseTime on the blacklist, even though SenseTime is doing an IPO currently. And we saw this in a variety of others. So there's pressure on you from a US regulatory standpoint. They're putting Chinese companies on the blacklist, but at the same time, the Chinese government is also cracking down. You saw with the Didi listing, you saw also what happened with Alibaba, et cetera. So it's kind of like both governments are putting more stringent restrictions on their companies. But to answer your specific question, Shannon, I mean, I think that companies are definitely under pressure to having to choose. You saw this particularly acutely with LinkedIn, with their decision to leave from China. This notion of data and protecting consumers' data, with the Beijing's strong concern for data at its core will belong to the central government. And the Chinese government has made that very clear to internet service providers, to Didi in particular. And so I think that they're under enormous pressure from both sides, both Chinese government as well as the United States government, to kind of choose sides in many different ways.
Obviously, the Peng Shuai case recently has gained a lot of attention, not only because of Peng's allegations of sexual assault and then, disappearing and reappearing under circumstances that many found suspicious, but because the Women's Tennis Association took a very strong stance on this issue and essentially said, we're pulling out of China for the foreseeable future until our concerns are addressed. So I wonder, is there a possibility that this becomes the start of a trend? Are we going to see more companies doing this? Or is this just a very specific circumstance? Because this involved a specific person that presumably many people in the WTA knew personally. And it's very easy to feel a vested interest in that in a way that it might be harder for, say, the NBA to feel a vested interest in democracy in Hong Kong. So Craig, can you weigh in a little bit on whether you think we're going to see more sort of human rights motivated divestments from China? Is that just ultimately not a concern for most businesses, unless it becomes a PR difficulty for them? Or is this something that companies are actually thinking about?
It is a concern for them for sure, but most companies are not in the position that the women's tennis found themselves in, where essentially a handful of very high-profile professionals can decide with enough authority that the rest of the group goes along, and those high-profile individuals are willing to take the economic cost associated with not playing in China for some period of time. And the tennis association was really left with no alternative but to agree. Most companies are not in that situation. Most companies don't have the ability to walk away from one of the world's largest markets, one of the world's fastest growing markets, and therefore they will not make a decision to just pull out in its entirety. They are political animals as well as economic animals, and so they will do their best to come up with a compromise that says, we won't buy from a particular sourcing mechanism, whether it's child labor or whether it's repressed minorities or other things. We will encourage good governance. We will require other parameters that the West considers good ESG kinds of actions. But the alternative of just pulling out entirely, whether it's from a marketing perspective that is selling goods into the country, or whether it's from a sourcing perspective, that's just not an economic cost that most companies will be willing to make, and they won't be required to because of the alternatives that are available in terms of these sort of tweaking of things around the edges.
I want to ask Jacob to weigh on this as well. But first, just a reminder to our audience, if you haven't already answered the poll questions, please do that. We'll be closing it momentarily, and I'm going to take a look at your answers to help guide our discussion in the next few minutes. But Jacob, I'd like to get your thoughts on this idea that companies in the US and China are being or could be forced to choose between one side, again, because you have a unique perspective, particularly working at a publishing company in China, which I think a lot of us, when we think of China, we think of censorship and the difficulties that the publishing industry faces. And yet there you are in Shanghai working for a multinational publishing firm. So how have you seen this question play out from Shanghai?
You're right. Here I am. I published 63 books about business, economics, politics, and law this year. Unless I'm severely mistaken, we always peer review our books because we try to avoid publishing Chinese propaganda. So unless Earl really truly hoodwinked me and he's actually part of the United Front, I think that we are succeeding. In addition to that, I write regularly for the Financial Times Chinese version, which is censored in China, but it's still basically everyone who reads it is a Chinese person with a VPN. It's in Mandarin. And I write for various other media as well. So I just mentioned that because you would think, well, you know, if it's a new Cold War and I live in Moscow in 1953, is there Jacob living in Moscow in 1953? I wasn't there, but I want to guess probably not. Now, it's interesting. I suggested earlier that the Chinese government wants to incentivize companies to be in China if they can do something China cannot do for themselves. So the company I work for, Springer Nature, it's mostly in China for Nature, the science research journal. And this is a great example of what China can maybe not do for itself, not because China cannot produce great scientific research, it can. In fact, 33% of published papers in Nature are from Chinese institutions now, but rather when there's a debate about, for example, the lab leak thesis that came out in Science, our competing journal, when there's a debate about carbon emissions and how credible China's claims are, when there's debates about the biomedical ethics of CRISPR or gene modification, simply speaking, you know, if the Shanghai Office of Nature spins off and it's like, okay, we found corruption, now this is a Chinese-owned Nature, simply speaking, it will not have the same credibility with foreigners as Nature does. Therefore, it seems like the Chinese kind of want to keep Nature not exactly on side, because, well, I guess I would say what I tell to my colleagues at Nature is I think very strongly that we should avoid needlessly antagonizing China. For example, Chinese institutions do not buy all of the books that I publish. You know, they can take a catalog of books, and if they say we don't want this, this, and this, that's fine. That's about the amount of censorship that we do. We don't actually censor any of our books, which are all published in London, and so are not subject to any interference. But it seems to me that if companies, of course, it's different in different situations, right? For Nike sneakers, it's not this way. But if companies try to bend over backwards too much to become too Chinese, then why does China need them anyway? Because China has tons of scientists. China has tons of bankers. Why does China need Goldman Sachs if they're just going to become another Chinese investment bank? China has tons of those. So ultimately, it seems to me that in the current situation, the value providing that foreign companies such as my own can provide to China are exactly in the place where Chinese people could not do this for whatever reasons, legal, institutional, cultural, or otherwise. I think that's a very different story when it comes to large consumer brands such as, say, Nike or Coca-Cola. I was mentioning recently, I did a piece for FT Chinese about this question. You know, should a company like Prada, the Wall Street Journal suggested Prada should leave China for some reasons. But in fact, Prada's 47% of their sales are in Greater China. So how are you the CEO of Prada, or for that matter, the CEO of Volkswagen, which is the largest company in Germany, or indeed the president of Germany, in a country where the largest company is Volkswagen, and you say, you know what, we're just going to subtract 10, 20, 30, 40% of our annual profits. And that's not a position any CEO can really take. On the other hand, it seems the real asymmetry is because the Chinese economy is actually not run by business. So if somebody decides that it's time to kick out, you know, H&M, doesn't matter what H&M is doing business-wise, they can just do it, you know, and just from one day to the next, H&M can just be gone. So in other words, political choices on the part of the political leadership can, in fact, be catastrophic. Whereas I struggle to imagine if President Biden decided tomorrow, we are not going to have, you know, President Trump tried to do that with some of these Chinese tech companies such as Huawei. Even then, it was very, very difficult. It's not like the situation here where from one day to the next, you go to the H&M, well, it's closed. because of the wrong tweet or something. So that asymmetry in, frankly, the rule of law or the decision-making process makes, it seems to me that the risk for these consumer-facing companies, they become very risk averse, and sometimes they self-censor themselves much beyond the limits of what China actually needs.
I think your point that you ended on factors in really well with the poll results, which our host Michael just shared, which points to rising popularism and nationalism in the US and China as the issue that most people, not by a huge amount, but sizable enough, are concerned about in the relationship. And I think that's really what you were getting to, Jacob, is it's not necessarily the Chinese government that is demanding companies make these changes. A lot of times it's ordinary Chinese people who are finding a product that they find offensive or somehow insulting to China's national dignity, and then it snowballs into a massive campaign. So I'd just like to ask our panelists to briefly weigh in, starting with Earl. Do you agree that rising popularism and nationalism is the greatest area of concern in the relationship?
I would say it is a significant concern in the relationship. And you see this by and large. We saw this acutely under the Trump administration. And you're seeing this in many ways in China. And we've been seeing this in China for the last few decades. I think in many different ways, nationalism fuels so many different types of fears. And what those can translate into is the potential for real conflict, whether that be in the South China Sea, over Taiwan, and a variety of that. But that, in my mind, is the most quintessential concern, is some kind of conflict over a specific, a specific military conflict. I have the pleasure of having a great mentor who's a 3-star general in the Air Force. And whenever I go to DC, we go running around Martin Luther King Memorial. And I always ask them the same question. What is the single most biggest issue that keeps you up at night as a military official? And he consistently says the issue of Taiwan and being able to miscalculate, and the United States being able to underestimate or overestimate China's capabilities, China being able to underestimate or overestimate the United States' abilities. So I think that in my mind are some of the quintessential concerns.
Yeah, we certainly heard a lot of speculation that China was imminently preparing for an invasion of Taiwan, which of course did not turn out to be credible, but I think it was valuable in the sense that it forced people to think about this issue a little bit more seriously and with closer to the urgency that it deserves. I want to look at another question on the poll, which is slightly more optimistic, the area that gives people greatest hope. And here we have a very close results between climate engagement and cultural exchanges, which I found very interesting because my perception is that cultural exchanges are sort of under siege, whereas climate engagement has been a rare bright spot today. So, and I think something that gets left out is climate engagement is not just, John Kerry talking to Xi Jinping. It also is taking part at the company level. So Craig, I wonder if you could weigh in on this in terms of, are companies engaging with each other from the US and China on green technology, renewable energy, electric vehicles, all of these technologies that are necessary and critical to make progress on climate change? Is that something that's happening, regardless of what we see in the headlines about US-China formal talks?
Well, I don't think it would be accurate to say that companies are engaging across borders for the purpose of dealing with climate change in sort of an abstract sense. What companies are doing is recognizing that China has significant advantages in the production and in some cases the technology associated with elements of a green economy. And that means, they are by far the largest producer of solar panels, for instance. They are among the largest, if not the largest producer of components of turbines for wind and so forth. And so there is a lot of engagement across companies on those types of sourcing and other arrangements. That's different than they're getting together to discuss, mutual benefits of converting their economies to a green based generation just for sort of social good purposes. The reality is, in that regard, there is a lot more talk and a lot less action coming out of COP26 and coming out of a lot of other initiatives that we just have to be realistic about, right? This global warming situation is not going to be solved by the range of measures that are currently contemplated, particularly the very long-term zero carbon targets that have been put out and signed on to by countries that have no possibility of actually achieving those, even if they had the will to do. They don't have the economic ability. So it's you have to separate the hype from the reality in that regard.
Jacob, we were talking earlier in the pre-panel discussion about climate change in China and how it's both extremely urgent, particularly for folks like yourself in Shanghai, but also kind of secondary to some more immediate concerns. So I wonder about the potential for these two areas of concern to sort of counteract each other. Is there a possibility for greater US-China cooperation on climate change, or are these trends of rising nationalism, rising suspicion going to sabotage that?
Well, first of all, it seems to me that these climate-related events are just, for example, last week we saw these horrible, was it a tornado in Kentucky? I think things like that are just going to be part of the landscape indefinitely. And there's just going to be, there were floods in Zhengzhou last year, just for example. That kind of stuff is just going to keep happening. So in that sense, structurally, both countries will, on some level, be dealing with climate change. Whether they deal with it well or not is another story, but this problem is not going to go away, and it's going to keep knocking on the door, and no amount of ignoring it will make it go away. So some scholars I know, there's this great guy who used to be at NYU Shanghai, he recently left, and he would talk about the analogy between COVID and climate change, and seeing like, okay, with COVID, we saw two really different responses. On the one hand, the US had this very rapid development of vaccines, but well, you guys lived through COVID in the US, I didn't, so I won't tell you about that. But with China, they, of course, maybe similar to carbon emissions, it actually came from China. And they quickly used kind of authoritarian and technocratic means, especially involving like big data and AI-driven technologies with their health code tracking system to kind of squash the virus. But one of the implications of that was just that many Chinese people got used to and are comfortable with. They just live in a tower block and they almost never leave, and food is delivered to their doorstep. And that can just happen at the snap of a finger anywhere in China at any time. You can just be in your city, it's just announced, okay, lockdown this week, or you can't travel to this place this week. I think that does offer a disturbing vision of what it might look like. But to the extent that there's two halves of this coin, one is, can we stop making further emissions? And I sure hope that we can collaborate on that. That would be a point of collaboration. But the other point is, okay, so now these are happening. What do we do about it? And to the extent that China remains the kind of manufacturer of the world, I think it's right, as Craig was saying, that if we want to buy, for example, electric EV cars, China has the world supply of cobalt. Well, I guess we're going to buy Chinese EV cars. If we want to buy solar panels, well, it's too bad because it seems like most of them are made with lithium from Xinjiang. Well, I guess we have the choice, have solar panels or don't have solar panels. And if we make that choice that we want to have them, we're just going to have to get Chinese ones. We don't have another alternative. Maybe I'm misspeaking. And the same could be going on and on. And in particular, just to the extent that China is developing all these technologies or ways of adapting, the question will not just be, do we collaborate, but even do we adapt some of them? And realistically, Shanghai and the United States are not the people most vulnerable from climate change. That would be many of these developing world countries, places like Bangladesh, places like, you know, in the Middle East or Africa, where you have mass movements of refugees for reasons connected to climate change. So in a way, you know, will we in Virginia be seeing that we're like getting great Chinese technology to deal with climate change? Maybe, maybe not. But if China is able to use its technologies in the developing world, that would also be good. It's a subject I could talk a long time about for. I'll stop myself, but I recently wrote an article for Noema magazine, Noema, called China's Green Long March, which was kind of about my observations of China on the ground in a kind of poor industrial region, and how people, like the Appalachia of China and in the Northeast, and how people were responding to this idea of carbon neutrality, even though it's threatening a lot of their livelihoods to stop the oil and the coal.
Yeah, it's a reminder that despite the many differences between the US and China, we also have some very similar political problems, which is there's very influential political stakeholders involved in the fossil fuel industry, and that makes the transition to green energy quite difficult, regardless of what the governments might want to do on their own. So I want to remind our audience, we are wanting to take your questions. I don't see anything in the Q&A yet, so I'll ask another question of my own, but please, this is your chance to pick the brains of our expert panel. So drop a question in the Q&A and hopefully I'll have one to share next.
There are actually two questions in the Q&A.
Oh, there are.
So I can actually read them if you can't see them, but let me know if you can.
Yes, I can now. It wasn't alerting me about them. Okay, thank you for that, Earl. All right. Yeah, I think Michael Tierney's question is one that has often come up in my mind. So we will start with that about President Biden's effort to counter the Chinese BRI with Build Back Better World, B3W. Is this a serious alternative to China's BRI or a drop in the bucket? Are the terms attractive to developing country governments? Can this seriously compete with China, really, is the essence of the question. So Earl, maybe I'll have you weigh in on that first. Jacob and Craig, feel free to add on if you'd like to.
Thank you so much. And Professor Tierney, thanks so much for the great question, as always. And it was great seeing you at homecoming at the Global Research Institute. It's a great question. And I think the fundamental reality is the United States knows that it can't really compete head to head with China. When you look at things like the Belt and Road Initiative, I'm reminded of when the then Premier Wen Jiabao went to Africa and met with the late leader Mugabe, from the former president of Zimbabwe, and said, look, we are looking to engage Zimbabwe in a formidable way economically, and we don't have to worry or talk about things like human rights. I mean, when African leaders hear that, that is music to their ears. Because from a lending perspective, when you look at institutions like the IMF or the World Bank, historically, there's always been this notion of conditionality with respect to, human rights improvements, et cetera. So that's number one. Number two, I think that the Biden administration is moving towards more of an alliance structure where they work collaboratively and in sync with institutions and organizations and structures like the Quad, which comprises of Japan, Australia, India, as well as with ANCUS. You saw that particularly with United States, Australia, United Kingdom, to form a really an alliance which can really more effectively compete and kind of engage China in a more meaningful way than the United States itself. I think you're also finding this to be a strategy that the United States believes is more effective, but more credible for being able to engage China with the myriad of transnational issues that they're presented.
One part of the B3W that sticks out to me is it's framed around attracting private companies to do most of the heavy lifting in terms of funding. And I'm just not sure that there's that appetite among private companies in America or Europe to do that. So maybe Craig, you can speak to this question. Do you think that there's a willingness on behalf of private firms in America in particular to invest in, building a railroad in Indonesia or highways in Kenya?
It's very difficult, right? I mean, the private companies are incorporated for the purpose of doing risk return analysis of projects and pursuing these projects where it makes economic sense from the perspective of the shareholders, and increasingly broader range of constituents as well, but still largely shareholders. And the risk components of these projects are very difficult, and they're difficult even if the project works on a as expected basis. They're impossible when it doesn't work as anticipated. The cost overruns, or there COVID kind of disruptions, for instance, that constrain the ability to move labor and capital and so forth. So it's at that point you're left with remedies specified in contracts where you would be effectively at the mercy of the local courts and so forth for enforcement, if not for adjudication, because sometimes they rely on other English courts or whatever. So that's just a long way of saying most of the projects that are contemplated in the form of third world, in particular infrastructure, they're just hard to get through normal private sector institutions. Now, that being said, China is increasingly aware of the risk return and associated considerations itself. And Earl, you can comment on this as well, but the financial contributions that they are making to through Belt and Roads to countries that they targeted have come down substantially over the last couple of years, right? The figures I saw were 7 billion this year versus, or 2020 versus 20 something in 2016. So they're aware of these issues as well. And further, I think while we think about Belt and Roads as being incredibly creative and successful, it's not an unqualified success in any respect. That is to say, there are a lot of externalities that have gone into these projects and the conditions and so forth that countries that are the recipients are increasingly aware of, increasingly talking about, and it gives the U.S. and the Western countries an opportunity to engage in dialogues that go beyond just financial, pecuniary considerations, full stop.
Yeah, I'll just add in another plug for William & Mary's own aid data, which I consult quite frequently, and I know many other media outlets do as well. They're doing great work tracking these investment figures, so you can look there to see the trend that Craig was talking about in terms of the numbers dropping. Jacob, did you want to weigh in on this question of the BRI versus the B3W?
Well, I think the reality is just that China is a command economy and the United States is not. In some ways, you might say that that is a good thing about the United States. I think that if the US tries to compete with China in having huge state-driven and capital allocations, it might be inefficient for political reasons. I don't think it's a good idea because that's not really what we do best. So as Craig was saying, I think there's already a decreasing of appetite that often has a kind of nationalist undercurrent for the Belt and Road, where you'll hear Shanghainese people being like, why are we building roads in Africa when some random thing that has nothing to do with it, like when someone didn't take out the trash? And you're like, well, these two things aren't connected. But ordinary Chinese people, they do wonder why. I mean, China is a country that still has literally hundreds of millions of poor people. There's this great book that came out this year. I don't agree with all of its conclusions, but called Invisible China by Scott Rozelle, where the author, who's a researcher at Stanford, points out that hundreds of millions of rural China children are having, stomach worms, or they may have like their malnutrition is such that they're having developmental impairments. So I think if I was to guess, I would say that a lot of the investment of China in the developing world will be made in China in the next 5-year plan, because a lot of places in China are, effectively as poor as some of these developing countries. Conversely, though, I think that a lot of the Chinese companies, such as Huawei, for example, one of the reasons why they can do well in the developing world is that they are adapted to the kind of poor conditions of a developing village in China. If your Huawei phone does not work in a village in Guizhou, it's not a very effective for its market. Whereas if an Apple iPhone, it's not intended to work in a poor village that has power outages and doesn't have a road. So I often find that a lot of the Chinese economic model does seem suited to a rapidly urbanizing, very unequal society with uneven access to infrastructure, whereas products made for the American consumer market or the whole American, let's say, economic model, it's just a lot easier to turn a place in Indonesia into like a 5th-tier city in Anhui than it would be to turn that place in Indonesia into, Fairfax, Virginia. So I think we'll see, but I think that there's going to be a pullback of Chinese state investment in Belt and Road, and a lot of these initiatives will be led more, actually, ironically, like the Build Back Better is proposed to, with Chinese companies being coerced to do the state's work on its behalf, but also finding profit there, because in the end, even Huawei is not going to build a highway in Indonesia if they're not going to be able to sell phones. Huawei built a lot of mobile telephone network in Mexico in the past 5 years, and that's a great example. So the uptake of internet in Mexico per capita has almost doubled in the last 10 years, largely because Huawei has built this mobile infrastructure. And then, of course, those people buy Huawei phones. So that's a kind of super large scale investment. You have to be a pretty big company to decide to create a whole telecoms network for Mexico, but it could potentially have returns. But there are not that many companies in the world or the United States that can literally do that kind of thing. So
one other important way that the Biden administration is trying to compete with the Belt and Road is in particular engaging Southeast Asia in a more meaningful way. And I think you saw that in particular with Secretary of State Blinken's opening remarks in Indonesia. You mentioned Indonesia, Jacob, just today with his free and open Indo-Pacific speech. I've just put it in the chat for everyone right now. But I think it is a very important and meaningful strategy where the United States is trying to engage Southeast Asia, ASEAN in particular, as a way to further compete with things like the Belt and Road, et cetera.
Yeah, I think they should make Obama the honorary ambassador to Indonesia. That would have been a great idea since he grew up there, but maybe he doesn't want to do that.
Okay, we're coming near to the end of our discussion. And since I know we have a lot of students in the audience, I want to ask something that might be of more interest to them, which we have in this chat Earl, who just edited and published a book on US-China relations, and Jacob, who works for a publishing company. So do you have any advice for William & Mary students or alumni how to break into the publishing industry so that one day you too can serve on a fascinating panel like this? Well, Earl, maybe you can chime in first, and then Jacob can give a bit more advice from the publishing side.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, I am extraordinarily thankful to so many people on this call, like once again, Craig and Jacob, who gave me the opportunity to be able to publish my first book. It makes a great Christmas present, FYI. And I think first and foremost, one is just getting your voice out there. It has to be something that you are passionate about, that you can speak about with a certain level of authority to a certain degree, but also just having the bold, ability to get your work out there. I've never thought of myself as a good or great writer, but when Jacob said to me, "Hey Earl, have you ever thought about an edited volume?" It was during COVID. A lot of people were at home, and so I would write after I put the kids down and after I finished the dishes from 11 o'clock at night to about 2 in the morning. And I did this for a number of weeks. It was one of the hardest things, did this for a few months, and it was one of the hardest things I ever did. But I'm so thankful that I did do this and engage in this process to be able to get some thought leadership out there. And I would say, if you're thinking about it, definitely speak to friends and colleagues who have done it, so you have like get some good best practices. But then just go ahead and do it, and the more that you write, the better your ability to kind of formulate your thoughts. And so that's what my advice would be.
Yeah, I'll chime in from my perspective as the editor of an online magazine. You don't have to start with a book like Earl did. You can start with something a little more manageable. Even we publish pieces as short as 500 words. And I'll say one of the most important things, if you are a young up and coming writer, is to pick a topic that you're not seeing much else written about. Your chances of getting published, if you're pitching me on something like the big picture implications of the Belt and Road, are much lower than if you pick something very unique, like the music scene in Shanghai or Beijing, or something that isn't being covered as much that you think is important, and then explain why you think it's important and why you have the expertise necessary to write on this topic. And then you've got my attention. But I'll let Jacob also address this from the perspective of a publisher. What advice you would give to young students or alumni hoping to break in?
Well, I think that having the self-confidence to do it is the really, really key factor. So when I look back on my education, there were two highlights. One was Montessori preschool, which I think has given me the confidence to just, a lot of people have this imposter syndrome. They're like, why should I write a book about this or do X, Y, or Z? But then there's a certain class of kind of psychopathic people who believe that they can do whatever they set their minds to. And if you have that self-belief, then why not? I'll write a column about this or that or the other thing, or I'll consult for this company, whatever. So I think self-confidence is really crucial. As to how I got into publishing, it's actually great to say it on this panel. My classmate from William & Mary was working in the office in New York. And at that time I was working at some random Chinese magazine in Beijing. It was in 2015. And he was like, oh, we're hiring in China. Are you interested? So I think going to William & Mary is definitely number one reason how I got a job into publishing, without any question at all. And yeah, lastly, I said to Earl, and I think that this is how I see it. A book nowadays, people read a lot of stuff. People often read on their phones. They may read ebooks. So the book is not only the end in itself, rather it can be a platform. And it's been amazing for me to watch how Earl has, gone to all these conferences, given all these talks. For him publishing the book, it wasn't the end. It was really actually kind of the beginning. And all of us on this call are young and energetic. And I don't think that these issues we're discussing are going anywhere anytime soon. So who knows, maybe Earl will write 15 or 20 more books, or maybe he will actually be unable to because he will be, the governor of Rhode Island or something like that pretty soon. So I think seeing the book not as an end in itself, but as a part of a holistic process of speaking, writing columns, writing longer form things, maybe consulting, maybe activism, and all these things kind of fitting together in a single direction, which is most likely whatever that passion is. If you have the passion to, for example, understand China's ESG investments, well, you might be consulting for a private company. You might be writing for a newspaper. Maybe you're going to write a longer paper, which could even be a book. You might be giving, and really the focus is not on the actual medium, but on the actual objective that you have, I think. With that said, if any William & Mary professors want to publish a book, you can feel free to contact me at jacob.dreyer@palgrave.com.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We could keep talking for hours and hours and hours about US-China relations, but we are out of time. So I will kick it over to Michael to wrap us up.
Well, I wanted to say thank you to all of you for a terrific hour. I mean, really fascinating. I'm not an expert. I have no books publishing. Maybe the music one. I might take that angle up. I have sung with a Chinese superstar actually at the Kennedy Center one time many years ago. So I love that little angle that you suggested, Shannon. But Dr. Hansen, thank you so much for kicking us off, for leading us and demonstrating what William & Mary is doing. What a terrific last question, to wrap it up, to make it more how William & Mary is bringing a global issue that is front and center on many leaders' minds, both politically and economically, and what is happening is going to impact all of us. But the study of it and the research happening at William & Mary is right there, leading many papers and journals, which is terrific, and a sign that Williamsburg may be not the largest city, but it's impacting the globe from its talent there and beyond. So, but on behalf of all of us in the William & Mary community, thank you so much. Special shout out to Mike Tierney, who asked the first question from the audience, who also is leading a terrific group at the Global Research Institute. So glad he was able to join us as well. Any closing remarks, Dr. Hansen? I'll let you.
So, Michael, I'll just join you in thanking the panel. That was a really amazing hour and a feast. And I just wish we could have another hour. Actually, there's a lot of questions we didn't get to. So our apologies collectively to those who asked questions. But this is not the end of our conversation. I'm quite sure it's the beginning. So thanks, everyone.
Take care. Happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you.